Hello, and welcome to my great read. My name's Richard Vobes, and this is my little channel about what good books there are to read, in case you're looking for something. Well, today I'm recommending this. It's Goodnight Mr Tom by Michelle Magorian, and it is a fantastic read, if you don't mind a bit of a tearjerker. It was published in 1981. So it is a bit of an old book. It's been around a bit, but it's a classic. So it doesn't mean because it's old, it's no good. It just means that, as I'm recommending it, and a lot of people like it, it just means that it is a fantastic read. And if you don't mind a bit of a tearjerker with lots of tragedy and lots of high points, it could be for you. So when is the book set? The book is set during the Second World War, around about 1939. Now, for those that don't know, back in 1939, at the beginning of the Second World War, London was one of the cities that was bombed terribly, particularly in 1940 at the beginning of the Blitz. Well, at the beginning of the war, a lot of people were fearful that the German bombers would do exactly that, bomb the cities. Not just London, but many of the other cities, like Manchester, like Birmingham, like Coventry, like Portsmouth, like Exeter, lots of cities all around the UK. You might even live in one of those cities that was bombed during the Second World War, and you may not even know it. It's been a long time. However, because people feared that these cities were going to be bombed and there was going to be a lot of loss of life and houses would be demolished, as indeed there was, people evacuated their children and sent them out into the countryside where they thought they'd be safe. And of course, a lot of children were safe and they went away from their parents. Well, that's the sort of premise at the beginning of the book. We find that Willie Beach, who's our hero, he is sent away by his mother to the countryside and is billeted with this old man of 60 called Tom. Mr Tom, as Willie calls him. Mr Tom himself is a lonely figure, very sad figure, and we find out why he's sad. And actually the two, when they come together, Tom being forced to live, Willie rather, being forced to live with Tom, they find they sort of gel. These two different worlds mould together. So Willie Beach comes from the East End of London. He's physically and emotionally abused by his mother. But she sends him away, she does the right thing and sends him away where he meets up with Tom. Willie, he learns to read while he's at Tom because his education wasn't very good. He also learns to build an Anderson shelter in the back garden. An Anderson shelter is a small shelter dug half in the ground with corrugated iron over the top. And the idea is if a house is blown up or the bricks are flying and bits of bomb are flying, you take shelter when the German planes are flying overhead. So they build one of those in the back garden. Tom also makes lots of friends, new friends from other evacuees and people who live in the same village. The village is called Little Weirwold, by the way. An interesting name, I think you'll find. Willie takes part in the local amateur dramatics as well. He integrates into the community and is getting on really well. People like him and he's coming out of his shell. Well, the story then sort of takes a twist because his mum recalls him back to London. Despite the bombing, she says she's ill and she needs Tom to look after her. So he has to traipse back to London. Now, he thinks that's a great idea because he could be helpful. He does love his mother, and he goes back and finds things are not quite what they seem. Now, I don't want to ruin the story by telling you what happens because the joy of reading, of course, is letting it unfold. So it's interesting to see what happens, but some rather terrible and frightening things do happen. And Tom, Mr Tom, gets a bit worried about Willie and ends up having to go in search of him. I will say no more about that. What I was going to do, though, is read a small snippet from a chapter to give you an idea of the sort of book it is. So I'm going to read you a little bit from chapter 3, and the title of chapter 3 is called Saturday Morning. And I believe this is the morning after he has very first come to stay with this strange old man in this very peculiar open countryside. Coming from the East End, he doesn't really know what the countryside is about. He's been put into a little attic room, which is his own. So, when Willie woke, this is the following morning, when Willie woke, it was still very dark. Straining his eyes, he could just make out the 2 boxes which were stacked in the far corner of the room, and a picture frame which was propped up against them. He raised his arm and touched the sloping ceiling above his head. The pain that had brought him sharply back to consciousness seared violently through his stomach. He held his breath and pushed his hand down the bed to touch his nightgown. It was soaking. It was then that he became aware that he was lying in between sheets. That's what they did to people after they died. They laid them out in a bed. He sat up quickly and hit his head on the eave. Crawling out of bed, he doubled over with pain in his gut and hobbled over to the window and let out a frightening cry. He was in a graveyard. He was going to be buried alive. The pain grew intensely. He gave a loud moan and with a sudden retch vomited all over the floor. Well, he's not really in a graveyard, and I won't ruin the story by telling you why. And the reference to lying in the sheets is a lot of these poor little boys who were evacuated, especially those from inner cities, they didn't really know what beds were. Sometimes they slept under the bed. And we're talking about the 1940s, late 30s, 1940s, when they were crammed in tiny little places, maybe 3, 4 or 5 in a bed, and as I say, sometimes under the bed as well. So it is a historical novel with lots of references to stuff that may not always make much sense to you, but as you go on, it sort of explains it. So that's my recommendation. Goodnight Mr Tom. There has been a film made with it, made from it, with John Thor, who you may or may not remember from Inspector Morse. They were Colin Dexter novels that were turned into a detective series on the television. Anyway, he was the actor that did that. And there's also a stage play of the same production that is often going round the country. So if you get a chance to see that, it's absolutely fantastic. So there we go. Thank you for watching. Do join me again next time and I'll have another book ready for you. So in the meantime, have a good time. If you've got any comments, do put them down below. If you've read the book, I'd be fascinated to know what you think. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and you'll never miss an episode. Until the next time, bye for now.